They say in fiscal space no one can hear you scream, and I was screaming inside there. I suppose when you take a session that's looking at threats to the economy and threats to the Irish economy, you'd expect to hear talk of negative consequences, downside risks, over-reliance on certain factors. And in the main, I suppose you'd be right. But if we take the Irish economy at present, maybe the greatest threat we face isn't the looming spectre of the UK exit from the EU, or perhaps changes in the US tax code. Maybe the greatest risk we face is, one, domestically, that our own growth rates could be too high. Maybe the risk we face is that things could be too good. Like, we should have a positive outlook, and there's no doubt the Irish economy is recovering, but do we actually appreciate and understand the pace at which the Irish economy is recovering? Last year I stood here and I said that by the end of 2017, we'd have returned employment level to the peak of 2008, that we'd get back to the 2.1 million people in work we had in 2008 by the end of 2017. I was wrong. We're there already. I made a prediction with an 18-month window, and I was wrong by 6 months. Such is the pace and improvement in the economy. The predictions of growth are being outstripped on a regular basis. The unemployment rate has fallen to 6.3%. It's not so long ago that was at 15%. At an unemployment rate of 6.3%, we're not yet seeing pressures in the labour market, widespread pressures. There are maybe particular areas where labour shortages may be developing, but in the main we still have capacity in the economy. But those shortages are unlikely to be far away. And the last time we had such a dramatic drop in the unemployment rate in Ireland was in the late 1990s. We came through the problems of the 1980s, had a very high unemployment rate, and it then fell at a very rapid rate. And in a sense, we're possibly close to something like that now. And in fact, if you take the most recent figures we have, full-time employment in Ireland in the most recent figures was growing at 5.8% per year. So we'd almost 6% more people in full-time employment now as opposed to 12 months ago. The last time full-time employment was growing at that rate was 1999. So what we're comparing is back 17, 18 years ago. It's outstripping the growth that we had in the 2000s. So the growth is very rapid. And like now, the economy of the 1990s was an economy that had come through a period of falling growth rates. And a question that economists were addressing to each other, maybe to the wider public, was what's in store for the economy? What's in store for the Celtic Tiger was a question many people addressed in the late 1990s. Now there was a wide sort of variety of answers, but a general consensus emerged that the economy, after growing very rapidly throughout the 1990s, would return to its long-run average growth rate, which for Ireland is somewhere around 3 to 4%, which in itself is quite a rapid growth rate. But after growing at above 8, 10% in the mid-1990s, the prediction was that once we get into the 2000s, the economy would ease back to its long-run potential. Those forecasts turned out to be wrong. They were based on sound analysis, but they were wrong. And why were they wrong? They were wrong because we cheated. An economy faces constraints. There's a financial constraint in terms of how much you can spend, and there's a real constraint in terms of the resources you have. But we cheated both of those. And the people who were making the predictions back in the 1990s didn't foresee what was going to happen in terms of credit expansion. That we'd beat the financial constraint by borrowing money. Much of it we created ourselves through our own domestic banking system. Loans and deposits flowing from one bank to another, increasing the money supply. But such was our hunger, our demand to increase consumption and investment, that alone wasn't enough to satisfy us, and we had to borrow money from abroad. So there was a huge increase in the availability of credit in the economy. And we cheated the real constraint through net inward migration. A dramatic turnaround of outflow of people to a dramatic inflow of people. And this fueled and added to the growth right up to 2008. So back in the 1990s, when people had seen the 6, 7, 8% growth and said, what will happen in the future? Well, they said things will resume to a stable long-run growth rate. But that's not what happened. And the issue with an economy growing above its potential, so if our long-run potential growth rate is 3 to 4%, an economy can't grow above its potential growth rate forever. If something can't go on forever, it will stop. And the large and high growth rates of the 1990s into the 2000s stopped. So the credit-fueled growth came to, as we know, a shuddering halt in 2008, and we went through a painful process of reducing our reliance on credit. Most of the money was borrowed through the private sector, firms and households, in the run-up to 2008, but that then created a hole in the public finances and the borrowing moved into the government sector. And of course that became unsustainable and a large consolidation process had to go through to reduce that reliance on credit. And of course we had the return to outward migration. So both the things that were unseen in the 1990s, the credit expansion and inward migration, in a sense had to be reversed, and it wasn't a very positive process to go through. So what's in store now for the Irish economy? Again, we've gone through a period of quite rapid growth rates. It is quite difficult to measure where the Irish economy is because of the nature of it, because of the impact of our success in attracting foreign direct investment. Some of our economic statistics can be skewed, but a 6% growth in full-time employment is a real increase. And our economy is probably growing at somewhere between 6 and 7% at the moment. And that is quite a large growth rate. And as with the 1990s, even though the growth rates are quite high, there are very few signs of pressures or overheating or problems. So if we were to make a prediction about the Irish economy, maybe we'd take the same route that was taken in the 1990s. That we'd just come through a massive crisis, recovered from that crisis, maybe had a bit of bounce back, and now we'll return to our long-run average growth of somewhere between 3 and 4%. But if we look at that long-run average, and if we add a percentage point at each end, so rather than a narrow range of between 3 and 4, if you look at a range of between 2 and 5, and say, well, that's sort of a broad range of the long-run potential of the Irish economy, and we take all the years since 1960, 57 years to which we have data, for 18 of those 57 years, the Irish economy grew between 2 and 5%. So what's our long-run average is only something that happens 1/3 of the time, even if we make the range a bit broader. So the Irish economy is incredibly volatile. The middle of that range is 3.5%. If you look at most long-run forecasts, medium-term forecasts of the Irish economy, including those produced by the Department of Finance, they average 3.5%. But yet that's something that doesn't happen. Now those medium-term forecasts have been endorsed by the Fiscal Council. So I'm not going to say that they're wrong, but there are risks to them. Like if 2 to 5% is the range, is it to be the case that we'll have negative outcomes and the growth will drop below 2%? Or is it the case that there's positive risks, upside risks, and the growth could be above 5%? And in my view, the risks are balanced to the upside. We're more likely to have the growth above 5% rather than below 2%. Yes, you might say there are external threats, but equally, of course, there are some domestic elements that could cause the growth to be higher. So the economists in the 1990s didn't foresee sort of the wall of credit that we were about to create, or the influx of migrants that enabled the excess growth of the 2000s. So could there be pressures of unsustainably high growth building up in the Irish economy again? They may not be there at the moment, but they could build up. So there's no fixed set of knowing when an economy is overheating. It's a bit of an anomalous concept. It's a word or a phrase we use to describe an economy performing above its capacity, above its potential, but it's very difficult to tell when it's happening. How do you measure potential? Like, we all have great potential to do lots of things. If you devote enough time to something, you can do almost absolutely anything. So with an economy, which is just a group of us, what's the potential of an economy? So you try to look for indicators that might point you in that direction. Some indicators that might point to an economy sort of overperforming itself would be a rapid growth in investment or consumption, if you had rising price inflation, both consumer price inflation and asset price inflation, including housing, if you'd below average unemployment, if you'd rising real wage inflation, particularly in comparative terms with other economies, if you'd a reduction in the savings rate, if you'd increasing growth in private sector credit, if you'd a deterioration in the current account balance or interactions with the rest of the world, or falling net international investment position, if we were borrowing from the rest of the world. But at present, almost all of those indicators are positive. We have the high growth, but it's not creating adverse or overheating pressures in the economy. But equally, you could have said the same back in the late 1990s after the period of growth. And we all know what happened after that. So these are what happens when an economy runs above its potential. And these should be a concern for all of us, including those trying to attract investment from abroad, that if some of these indicators do turn in the wrong direction, it can lead to problems. And these problems may take a while to build up, 3, 4, 5 years. But equally, they take a while to correct. 3, 4, 5 years of a very painful adjustment. So the signs aren't evident at the moment, but maybe there are factors that could lead us in that direction. If we look out now, is there things that we can see that might indicate that the economy could be on or move in the direction of an unsustainable footing? So how might growth go above that 4, maybe 5% threshold, which we consider stable and possible to maintain in the long run? One area where growth could be higher is clearly in the construction sector, or housing output. So if you look at current growth forecasts, they take housing output last year of about 15,000 and predict that over the next 4 or 5 years, it will increase gradually and reach a level of 30,000 in 2021. So a stable, steady increase from a base of 15,000. Now, there are some disputes about what the actual level of housing output in the Irish economy is. I'm not a housing expert, with figures ranging from 5,000 to 15,000. But if you take, say, 10,000, just for the fact that it's in the middle, and there's equally a range over how many houses we need to meet the increasing population, to meet increasing housing demand, we could get better utilisation of the existing stock. But one would imagine that most of the additional housing we need would come from construction. And in general, it's expected that we need between 25 and 35,000 houses on an annual basis to keep up with increased demand. So if we're going from 15 to 30 in the forecasts and need somewhere around 30, that seems to be appropriate. But of course, the problem is we've gone through 7 or 8 years where we've built below the required level of housing. There's an excess and a pent-up demand that also needs to be satisfied. So building 30,000 houses a year wouldn't meet all the demand that's there. In fact, it's likely the housing output needs to be higher for a period, maybe rising to 40 or even 50,000. So if we've growth forecasts averaging 3.5%, with say 25,000 houses being built, what would happen if we were building 50,000 houses? Research from the ESRI suggests that every additional 10,000 increase in housing output adds about 1% to growth. So if you're talking building 20, 30 extra thousand houses a year, and your growth rate is, on a base case, 3.5, put 2 percentage points on that, you're on to 5.5. And of course, increased housing output can have knock-on consequences around the economy. If we're going to build those additional houses, where are the workers going to come from? The unemployment rate is 6.3%. We'll be below 6% pretty quickly. Are we going to get the workers, former construction workers working in other sectors, to come back into construction? Is there going to be competition between sectors in terms of trying to maintain and hold on to workers, driving up wage inflation, eroding our competitiveness? Or maybe we'll bring the workers in from abroad. But of course, that's bringing in people to solve a problem that they're actually adding to. If they come in, we have to house them. So not only do we have to build houses to house ourselves, we have to build houses to house them. And we may end up in a cycle that wouldn't put us in a very positive place. And if you look at housing and housing investment, housing output, a large part of it is likely to be funded by borrowing, particularly in the household sector, a large once-off purchase of a new house. And one issue this can create is that it doesn't lead to a reduction in demand elsewhere. Like you buy a house for 200,000 and you borrow 150 of that money is being put into the economy. It's not a case of you have to reduce your consumption by a huge amount to allow that 150,000 to enter the economy. So private sector credit has been contracting, even with the very high growth rates we have. As a nation, we've been paying back a lot of the debt we built up during the 2000s. But if we have a reversal of this, if private sector credit begins to expand, possibly through increases in housing activity, this will add further stimulus to already rapidly growing economy. So we can see the impact this could have on an economy in the 2000s. A lot of the increase in housing activity was funded with borrowing, and this doesn't just increase the investment side of the economy. Of course, it equally increases the consumption side, because that money feeds through the construction sector into labour, into materials, into land, income for individuals, and you lead to a sort of an upward cycle of growth being driven by credit-fueled expansion in one sector. So in order for the economy to be put in a sustainable pattern, it possibly requires contractionary measures in other parts of the economy to make room for the likely increase in housing output, actually to put our growth rates on a sustainable footing. Again, the problem being not that they're too low, but that potentially they could be too high. When the lending stopped in 2008, we had no reserve capacity to fill the gap that all that credit had created. We simply didn't have the capacity in either the public sector or the private sector to fill the gap that that huge lending, that the stalling of that huge lending generated. And of course we had to go in the opposite direction. The private or the public sector couldn't borrow to sustainably run a deficit of 20-25 billion a year. So not only had we the stopping of the credit driving into the economy, equally had the public sector increasing taxes and cutting spending. So in a sense exacerbating the problem of the too high growth rates of the 2000s. At present, based on all the indicators, there's nothing to say we're going down that track again. But it is a risk. We know the economy is growing very strongly. We know there's a demand for additional housing. If we try to do all of that, we simply may run out of resource base. It wouldn't be possible to achieve the increase in output that would be required. So while currently there's little sign of overheating pressure, given the way the unemployment rate is going, given the strength of the growth, we cannot say that this benign scenario will continue to be the case. So if this is a risk, well, what can we do about it? The question we're set is, how should we respond? Unfortunately, I suppose the risk of this domestic threat, and maybe to some extent the risk of the EU exit from the UK exit from the EU, or maybe changes to how multinational companies are taxed, are the same. If we view these as being something that could potentially harm us down the line, we should be building the capacity now to absorb the shocks that these might generate. In the lingo of economists, we should have a counter-cyclical policy. And this is something that's great in theory, but very, very difficult to do in practice. As a member of the euro, we no longer have control over exchange rates or interest rates, so we do have limited levers of monetary policy. We do have some. When it comes to borrowers, we could have loan-to-value ratios or loan-to-income limits for those borrowing. And for banks, we can limit maybe their activities through increased capital ratios, or loan-to-deposit ratios. So it's not that we've no levers when it comes to monetary policy, but we do have autonomy over fiscal policy, the tax and spending decisions of the government. We do have a reasonably complex, but possibly an overly complex fiscal framework based around EU and domestic rules. But as I said earlier today, even in the absence of those, it's still up to us to set the appropriate fiscal policy. They're a guide, they're a speed limit. But even if they weren't there, we don't want to be running the economy over the edge. The Irish economy doesn't need fiscal stimulus. Growth is high, unemployment is falling, consumption is rising, investment is rising. There's simply no case for fiscal stimulus. If we do need additional public spending, it should be funded through sustainable sources of revenue to ensure that it's done on a consistent and solid basis. And it's clear that there's sort of an awareness that the Irish economy could face similar problems to what happened in the 2000s. There's been talk over the last 12 or 18 months of something called a rainy day fund. Now this appears to be something at present we have in name rather than in function. Now a rainy day fund can and could form part of an effective counter-cyclical policy, but it's not necessary. You can do a counter-cyclical policy without a rainy day fund. So the potential for one of these arose during the general election. It's included in the programme for government. It's in the confidence supply arrangement in the Dáil. But at present, we don't have any or limited details about how this would work. How actually would it be a rainy day fund? Even the name kind of springs to mind something that's responsive, something that responds to changes. Like if you're dealing with the weather and that's changing, you're changing your clothes, you're bringing an umbrella, whatever you're doing something different in response to the conditions. How does a rainy day fund respond to the conditions? Well, at present, the proposals we have aren't very responsive at all. The initial proposal was from 2019 on to put 1 billion aside into this rainy day fund. There was no real basis for where this 1 billion figure came, whether it would change in different circumstances, or more importantly, maybe if the circumstances was a downturn, how would you get the money out? On what basis would these decisions be made? Subsequently, the decision has been made to drop it down, the contributions, to £500 million a year. Now, there has been reference to a discussion paper about how such a fund would operate. And I think the most recent reference to it was in the briefing note for the new Minister for Finance. And we'd like to see that discussion paper published. But it's not to say that this is an easy problem to solve. Having a rainy day fund seems attractive, but it's actually quite difficult to actually visualise how it might work, particularly within the fiscal framework we have. Saving the money mightn't be much of an issue, but do the rules actually allow you to spend it? Can you draw the money down when you need it in line with the fiscal framework we have? And if the objective is just to run a counter-cyclical policy. Maybe that's what we should aim for. In terms of using a rainy day fund, other countries do have them, so we can look to see are there templates there. But in the main, they seem to be countries that have windfall or temporary sources of revenue. In fact, if you look at our own last sovereign savings fund, the National Pension Reserve Fund, that was set up with the proceeds from the Aircom privatisation. And say the Norwegian Wealth Fund is based on North Sea oil revenues. Are there windfall or riches in Ireland that we could look to create a rainy day fund or a national wealth fund around? Well, possibly. One being corporation tax, something that has surged in recent years. If you go back 3-4 years ago, we were collecting $4 billion a year in corporation tax. This year it looks set to go to about $8 billion. So quite a dramatic rise in quite a short period of time. So one suggestion could be to maybe take part of that increase out of the fiscal arithmetic. Say, look, we're going to set that aside, balance the books, ignoring that money. In essence, run an overall surplus and set that money aside. And the advantage of running an overall surplus is, of course, you can spend it down. There are no limits on running for a surplus back to a balanced budget. So if you do hit difficulties, we have the capacity there, and even to go a bit lower, to start running deficits again, if the conditions warrant. The problem many countries have is that when they hit a downturn, they're already either running a deficit or close to it, and simply don't have the capacity to do the borrowing that downturn merits. And if we look at the provision of public services, the additional spending, providing public services on volatile corporation tax receipts, historically low interest rates, people paying us to borrow, to give us money, or one-off asset sales, say from the banking sector, is no way to ensure consistent provision of public services. What happens if those receipts fall? What happens when interest rates do inevitably rise? And what happens when we've all the banks sold? Where does the funds then come for the consistent provision of services? In fact, many of those who argue that the fiscal rules are limiting or in some way not allowing us to meet some of the public spending pressures we have should actually be ardent supporters of the fiscal rules. Because within that, you have a framework that makes sure the money is there all the time, not having it based on volatile performance of the economy. And we've seen the difficulty in having to withdraw income supports, withdraw services, and that's not something we want to go back to in again. So this is a lesson, a history lesson we shouldn't forget. And this is actually one of the reasons for the creation of the Fiscal Council, to institutionalise the memory of the crisis, so that even if ye forget, we don't. And we come and we stand up and say, do you not remember what happened? That we had a period of excess growth, that growth stopped, and we went through quite a difficult period of recovering the problems that were generated. Hugely successful in terms of where we are now, but wouldn't it have been better not to have gone through that? In fact, if you look at the Irish economy and go back to the 1990s and take our level of income, where we were in terms of employment, and just compare it to 2017, and just took the two endpoints, you'd say, what a remarkable economy. How did they manage that in just 20 years? To go from close to 1 million people employed to 2 million people employed. To go from living standards were below the EU average to above the EU average. If you took the two endpoints, you think it was a remarkable story. But you draw the line in the middle, and you see it shooting up, dropping down, and coming back up again. Wouldn't it have been better if it was just a consistent 4 to 5% every year? So the last decade has been spent repairing the scars of the crash. And there are some that remain, but we've cleared a lot of them. And though our debt levels remain high, choices and options are opening up for us. We can build 40,000 houses a year. We can build motorways linking our regional cities, urban rail connections in the Dublin area, the rollout of broadband across the country. We can reduce taxes. We can increase income supports. We can spend all the benefits of the surge in corporation tax, the benefits of historically low interest rates, the one-off sales of the banking sector. These are our choices to make, but we can't do sustainably. No lobby or special interest group is going to say that their request is the one that pushes the economy into the red. And they're correct. But we have to take into consideration the totality of what we're doing. If we fly too close to the sun and try to do everything, we will crash to earth. Maybe the biggest threats to the Irish economy aren't the decisions to be made by Theresa May and Donald Trump. Maybe the biggest threats are the decisions to be made by us ourselves in terms of the choices we face. And hopefully this time we can do it in a sustainable fashion. Thanks very much.